I'm glad to be done with the design phase of this project because I spent so much time on it. I'm also really excited to cut my parts out because I get to use the closest thing to a lightsaber I'll ever touch, a plasma cutter. My buddy Chi builds custom motorcycles, and he was gracious enough to lend me his plasma cutter for this project. Plasma cutters harness the power of the Force and mix it with electricity and compressed inert gas to make a searing hot beam of cutting awesomeness. Or something. I was too excited to pay attention. Before I get started, I need to pick up some supplies at Home Depot to make a template for my cuts, as well as some stuff to get my shop's air system ready. Speaking of my shop, I had some organizing to do. I cleaned it the night before, which was no small feat, but it could stand a few new arrangements. Once that was out of the way, I could begin the long process of building my part templates. The CAD software I used has a great option to print out the full-size drawings using standard 8x11 paper sheets. This is fantastic because I don't have to have a large format sheet outsourced. Aligning the pages would be almost impossible, but the software creates crosshair alignment marks on the sheets, which make a perfect alignment simple, albeit time-consuming. After temporarily taping the sheets together, I made sure to test my alignment by laying a part down on it. The edges and holes aligned great, so I permanently secured the sheets with tape. Cutting out the paper templates was tedious, and during it I realized it would have been good to put a center mark for the fan holes. But I was able to alleviate that problem simple enough. After my paper templates were finished, it was time to transfer them to a wooden drag board. I figured the mounting holes were the most critical part, so I started with them first by using a center punch to mark them on the board. After the holes were punched, I decided to transfer the template using spray paint. I was actually happy with how this turned out, and it was much faster than using a Sharpie, although it did make quite a mess of my paper. I still had to trim down my board, but it had been a while since I used my table saw and it was covered in spiders. I also had a solution for that. I could have used tape to secure my board, but I tried staples and it seemed to work. Everything seemed to be going well, but I realized I might have forgotten an important detail. I didn't really think about this before, but I actually have an offset that I need to worry about. And what I mean is, the kerf of the plasma cutter might be a little bit too wide for my aluminum, and to exacerbate the issue, the tip definitely has a thickness to it. So that means as I'm running along my edge, I'm actually not going to get a cut right directly on the line if I'm using a template because I'm going to be dragging against it. So my cut's going to be offset from the template. What I'm going to try to do is cut on the inside of the line with a jigsaw. And I'm hoping that the kerf of my jigsaw is going to offset the kerf of the plasma cutter and the width of the diode. I won't know until I give it a shot, so I'm going to get started. Although I use staples for this board, I still need to secure my material to the workspace. For this kind of thing, I use speed clamps. If I'm using regular C-clamps or pony clamps or something like that, and I'm trying to cut and they get in the way, I can't quickly take it off, reset it, and then go back to cutting. It just makes it a pain in the butt. So I really like these. They're really handy. Finally, some power tool action. It's been a while since I used a jigsaw, and I've actually never used it on wood, so I had to learn the technique on the fly. I probably should have practiced first. I did end up with something I could work with, but I had some struggles along the way. So modding can be frustrating. I don't think I'm at the point where I'm going to start tearing my hair out, but I did have kind of a hard time with that board. I'm not sure what the problem was. I think it was the blades. I'd really never used those before, and they were kind of getting hot or something and twisting. And as I was pushing forward, they'd keep wanting to like twist left. So I didn't really get the straightest line. The good news is I don't think I ruined my template. I just have to sand down the edges and try to get them looking right to my eyeball. And then what I can do is I can actually just use half of the template and mirror it. That way I'll have a perfectly symmetrical piece when it's all said and done. This is the real world, you know, it's handcrafted, so even if I cut out the whole thing and got it almost perfect, it really wouldn't be the same on both sides. But this way, it will look the same on both sides. That's the good news. There really is no bad news. I mean, worst case scenario, I just do it again. Sanding or filing is a critical step in making anything by hand. I'm always astounded by how professional and machine-like one can make a part by just spending some quality time with it with sandpaper or a file. When I was finished, my template looked perfect to my eye, even though it probably wasn't. Luckily, the symmetry of the part was here to bail me out. I finally had my template, but I still need to do a bit more work setting up for the plasma before I could start cutting out my parts. I already have 220 going to my shop for my MIG welder, but the outlet is different than that of Chi's plasma cutter, so I wired up an additional outlet in case I have to borrow it again. I also had to hook up my lines and some new equipment, which didn't take too long. So it is swelteringly hot here in southern Mississippi right now, and it's also a very humid day. And those are two things that air compressors don't like. The heat makes them run hotter, and of course the humidity gets sucked into the tank when it's compressing the air. Now, because the air compressor is so hot and the air outside is relatively cool, that means condensation is going to form in my tanks and in my lines. And plasma cutters don't like condensation, so I need to separate the water from the air as best as I can. So here's my setup. I have my air compressor right now, and it's outside because it makes a bunch of noise. And then I have a rather long line, this blue line right here, and it's rubber, and it's going into two different buckets. Now, the rubber does insulate the line pretty well, so unfortunately it's not going to dump a lot of heat, but every little bit counts. And then I have my copper line, which is coiled down in there, and that's going to help a lot more, and hopefully it's going to give me the little edge that I need to remove condensation. And then of course I have my water trap. Basically the air is coming in through this pipe straight up, and it's dumping water back into this tank right there. And then the compressed air will fill up and shoot out this hose into the back of the plasma cutter. But before it does, I have a air dryer that just uses little silicone desiccant beads. I don't know if I'm saying that word right. But when it's all said and done, hopefully I can combat all this moisture in my lines and I can get a decent cutting arc. A quick test showed I had a leak or two, but I was able to quickly find them and make repairs. With my power and air set up, I was ready to start cutting. Ever find something you are just terrible at? I do all the time. Unfortunately, I didn't want to be bad at using the plasma cutter. Granted, there's a lot to learn in balancing the air jet, voltage settings, drag angle, and drag speed, but after a couple hours, I was starting to think I would not be able to get clean cuts on my chosen material. That's just not going to work. The aluminum is too thick and too soft for that plasma cutter. It's too thick because it just keeps heating up, and when that plasma stream hits it, it just starts throwing little bits of molten aluminum everywhere. I cannot get a clean cut no matter what I do. The plasma is great for steel, absolutely great. I tried different thicknesses out, a 3/16, a 1/4 inch, and a 1/16 inch, and oh my goodness, it cut it beautiful and smooth like butter. My cuts weren't steady enough, but with enough practice, I think I could get good enough to use that template. But it really just had to do with that material. I even cut some thinner aluminum, and it worked great. But at that thickness, the aluminum doesn't shoot down like the steel does. It just turns into like blobs of molten metal and just flings everywhere. I got my camera completely covered in molten aluminum and my jeans, and I have holes everywhere, but I don't think it's gonna work right. And even if it did cut well enough, the edge is just so bad. And it just, even with sanding, I mean, I'd have to take more than a 1/16 off in some places. It's just bad. I really would hate to give up, especially after I installed all that shop equipment, but it's just not gonna give me the cut I need. I mean, I am bad at this. I'm not making excuses there, but I just don't think it's the right tool for that material. I needed a break and some sleep. After a night's rest, I was re-energized and gave it another shot. With the voltage at max, I was able to start getting some decent lines, but only on one side of the material. I decided since I worked so long on the drag templates, I was not going to let them go to waste, and I was going to try them out before I gave up. I'm using 6061T 1/4 inch plate for this build. and made sure to clean it really well for good electrical contact. With the template in place, I held my breath and started cutting. And that's how you spend an hour destroying $70 of aluminum. Well, I think the plasma would have worked if I had some argon and a lot more experience, but I'm officially gonna throw in the towel. I'm gonna have to do things the hard way or the really easy way and expensive way, and that's to get the water jet cut. I'm gonna try to do it the hard way first, but I'm really running out of time for this project. I'm already far behind because of the design took so long, and well, I got other things going as well. I wish I could delegate to you, Harvey, the Wonder Modding Dog. I decided to work on the motherboard tray first since it was the smaller, more manageable part. The trick to cutting metal with a jigsaw is removing vibrations, and I was lucky enough to have a huge block of foam that shipped with my awesome Dymastech test bench. I used a Sharpie this time instead of spray paint because it comes off easy with alcohol, in case I made a mistake. I have to say, the metal cutting blades I bought cut extremely well. The edges I got were actually cleaner than a water jet. Color me impressed. I still had challenging cuts to make on the inside, and I had to drill out places to insert my blade. I used a 1-inch flat bit on the curved corners. The bit took forever to cut through the metal, but the edges turned out great. All I needed to cut now were straight lines, and it actually went pretty easy. Slow, but easy. So it's time to cut out my flat piece for the main structure of my mod, and I have to take something into consideration, and that is the grain of the aluminum. If I bend it transversely, I'm going to get the strongest bend, rather than longitudinally, which could cause everything to crack. I wish I could use this piece of aluminum because it is almost the right size, but I can't because it's almost the right size. So instead, I have to cut out of this monster of this very expensive plate, which I don't want to do because I was going to use it for a desk. But all us artists have to make sacrifices, and this is kind of a minor one. Same as before, I had to clean my material so I could transfer my paper template to it using a Sharpie and a hole punch. I just had a lot more material to cover this time around. So I'm going to use the same technique I did before for the motherboard tray, and that is to use my jigsaw. The trick to cutting metal with a jigsaw is to keep it from vibrating. Now, I was able to use a nice square piece of foam for my last piece, but I had to go to Home Depot and get this pink insulating foam for this very large panel. And it's still not going to be thick enough, I think, which is unfortunate. This sheet cost about $12, but it's not that styrofoam that will crinkle and break and have pieces go everywhere. This will stay together. My blade was still too long for the thickness of the styrofoam. I decided to cross my fingers and cover my eyes and trim it. I have to say, it works pretty well. I wouldn't recommend plunge cutting with this mod, but you really can't do that with plate aluminum anyways. Now it was time to add some features to the surface of my panels. My awesome cobalt-coated bits made short work of the motherboard tray's many mounting holes. At first I wanted not to pierce the plate so I could have a clean backside, so I set the plunge depth of my drill to 90% material thickness. After I was done, I changed my mind on the idea for the hardware I wanted to use, and went back and did a pass-through in all the holes. Next up for some holes was my tower piece. This was going to be challenging because my drill press's chuck is no longer true, no thanks to some poor quality hole saws I used a long time ago. I tried using my hand drill and vise first, which wasn't easy. Then I tried my press, which, as expected, was horrible. For my last hole, I tried a different angle with my hand drill. That was worst of all. Eventually, I got all my features cut out, and I began the long but critical process of filing the edges. When I'm done, they should really look great. I really feel like this project is coming along, but I'm far from being done. The excitement of seeing this build put together, though, is pushing me on. The trick to cutting metal with a drill Now what's nice about marking on metal with a Sharpie is that a little alcohol will make it like it never happened. Now, I wouldn't recommend using alcohol to make all of your mistakes like they never happened, but I think you guys know I'm talking about it. Now, of course, I'm talking about rubbing alcohol, though I suppose that other forms could make things like they never happened either, at least in your head.